Hello, my name is Dr. Sarah Minslow. I am an assistant professor of children's and young adult literature at California State University in Los Angeles. The title of my paper is Separate is Never Equal: Children of Color as Activists for Racial Equality in Children's Literature. Narratives of the historical struggle for civil rights in the U.S. have most often focused on adult activists. The names Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez, and Malcolm X are well known and often referenced in educational settings and popular culture. Yet child activists have remained much less visible. With the exception of Ruby Bridges, who was the first Black girl to attend an all-white school following the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka decision in 1954, books about young people who were activists in the fight for racial equality and social justice have been nearly non-existent. There are many reasons why children of color as activists have not appeared frequently in children's literature or popular culture in the US. Firstly, our nation hasn't developed an adequate way of representing or talking about our racist past or ongoing systemic racism. When US history is taught, it is often from the Eurocentric white perspective and in ways that dangerously ignore mistakes of the past in favor of a more patriotic learning experience. One that suggests slavery, interring Japanese Americans, the Indian Removal Act, and even the Trump administration's Muslim ban are all part of progress or homeland security, and they are completely evaded in the curriculum. In 2019, Cynthia Greenlee published an article for Vox titled "How History Textbooks Reflect America's Refusal to Reckon with Slavery." In the article, she reports that through omissions, downright errors, and specious interpretations, particularly regarding racial issues, not everyone enjoys the perks of civic belonging or gets a fair shake in historical accounts. This is even true of textbooks used today, 400 years after Africans' 1619 arrival, more than 150 years after emancipation, with narratives more interested in emphasizing the compassion of the enslavers than the cruelty endured by the enslaved. This came to the fore of public discourse in 2016 when Scholastic published the picture book A Birthday Cake for George Washington that features Hercules, Washington's slave chef, and his daughter happily making a cake to celebrate their master. When Washington tells Hercules he's done a great job, Hercules says, "An honor and a privilege, sir." As Kira Parrott argues in her review of the book, young readers without sufficient background knowledge about the larger context of American slavery may come away with a dangerously rosy impression of the relationship between slaves and slave owners. And those with a deeper understanding are likely to find this depiction offensive. That they did, and Scholastic pulled the book within a few months of its initial publication. Greenlee's article goes on to trace how in the 20th century, white Southerners created ideologically driven narratives that yearn for the good old days, where whites sat atop the hierarchy and African Americans were faithful slaves, the erasure of the violence of slavery, the kindness of reluctant slave masters, and the profitability of slave labor dominated in textbooks. Even abolitionists portrayed Black Americans as inferior, though they argued that slavery was an evil with no place in a putatively Christian nation. Greenlee writes that such accounts shaped how generations of white Americans thought about their Black compatriots, and according to a rising cadre of Black educators, how Black Americans who read such books thought about themselves. Efforts headed by the NAACP during the 1960s led to revisions of textbooks, but still in 2018, the Southern Poverty Law Center, in a report called Teaching Hard History, American Slavery, found that 58% of teachers polled weren't happy with their textbooks, and almost 40% said their state offered little to no support for teaching about slavery. If children are not educated on these legacies of racism, then they are inadequately prepared to confront and dismantle them. A misunderstanding or evasion of historical atrocity contributes to the increasingly political and ideological divisions in the US, and there is an urgent need to educate young people in a more holistic and comprehensive way about US history from diverse perspectives that acknowledge wrongdoing and encourage a more inclusive American identity. Following the death of George Floyd in 2020, mass protests across the US erupted, with the protesters of all ages, races, classes, and religions, and many called to defund the police. Even in my tiny conservative hometown in rural Western North Carolina, a group of high school students organized a Black Lives Matter march. Across media outlets, young people were actively involved in the rallies, marches, protests, and exhibits calling for Americans to confront our history and the aspects of American identity that are embedded in racism. Stories about child activists throughout history can empower more children to take action. When stories of child activists have been told, they often feature white children. This seems to reflect something much more complex about the political power of children in the US. The reality is that children of color are not allowed to perform activism the same way without real threats of violence and death. Growing up in a small town nestled in the hills of the Appalachian Mountains was a wonderful experience for me. As a middle-class white Christian heterosexual cisgender child, I rode my bike all around country roads after school, caught lightning bugs with my cousins on the weekends, and went creek stomping and tubing down the river in the humid summer months. I never remember being taught to feel afraid or to constantly protect my body, at least not from the public servants whose job it was to protect me. I was allowed to be loud and take up space, to draw attention and not to shrink myself so as to avoid violence. So when I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' stunning letter to his son in Between the World and Me, I had very little personal point of reference. Coates writes, but all of our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. That the sociology, you must always remember that sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. And in this case, he's talking mostly about the Black male body in particular. While listening to the audiobook read by Coates, I found myself sitting in my car crying, sometimes sobbing, and questioning how I, as a white woman, can do my part to empower my mostly Black and brown students when so much of their own energy must be spent at no fault of their own on simply surviving in a society that has been taught to distrust, malign, dehumanize, and even hurt them daily. I struggled and continue to struggle with educating myself on how to be actively anti-racist. In US collective history, children are often the victims of deadly, racially motivated violence and injustice. Widespread attention has been given to the lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till in Mississippi in 1955, the Birmingham 16th Street church bombing that resulted in the deaths of these four girls in 1963, and more recently, the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in 2012. And just last week, on April 20th, 2021, 16-year-old Micaiah Bryant was fatally shot by police outside her home after calling them for help when older kids threatened her with assault. Black children as victims in need of pity and compassion, though often after the fact, has tended to overshadow any representation of Black children as empowered, actively engaged citizens standing up and speaking out against racism. And even when they do, there is often a clear and present danger. Coates writes, all my life I'd heard people tell their Black boys and Black girls to be twice as good, which is to say, accept half as much. Over the past 10 years, however, children's book authors and illustrators have increasingly produced narratives that portray children of color as activists for social change. Due in large part to the Black Lives Matter and We Need Diverse Books movements, the Project 1619 by the New York Times, the National Seed Project, the Social Justice Initiative, and the Teaching Tolerance Project, more people are demanding books that confront and dismantle racism in America. As a result, more books representing children of color as actively involved in the struggle for equality and emancipation have emerged. The books I want to share today highlight the agency and power of young people of color in the fight for social and racial justice. Though the 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery when passed in December 1865, Jim Crow laws continued to allow for discrimination against and attacks on people of color. The documentary 13th on Netflix and Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, really highlighted this. Southern segregation gained ground in 1896 when the US Supreme Court declared in Plessy versus Ferguson that facilities for Blacks and whites could be separate but equal. The separate but equal policies did not affect only Black people. Paul Ortiz's book, An African American and Latinx History of the United States, published in 2018, encourages readers to, quote, reimagine the past as a whole unifying the fights for liberty and equality into a continuous struggle. Ortiz's book serves as a curriculum and an ongoing story of liberation. In it, he writes, quote, I was born in 1964, and it was in fourth grade that I remember racial slurs being used against me for the first time. In her review of the book, Samantha Schuler highlights Ortiz's motivations, saying he points to a myth that structured his childhood, told to him by teachers and authority figures all his life. Latinx and Black people are paradoxically both lazy freeriders and cunning thieves who steal jobs, a countrywide conviction that continues today. Ortiz states, I wrote this book because as a scholar, I want to ensure that no Black, Latinx, or Black children ever again have to feel ashamed of who they are and where they come from. The intersectionality of Black, Indigenous, Feminist, and Latinx struggles for emancipation is one of the book's strengths, an act of resistance and rebellion in itself. Laurie Hall Sanderson's Seeds of America trilogy includes the novels Chains, Forge, and Ashes. Though fictional, the series draws on and begins each chapter with a quote from the letters, journals, and pamphlets of early American leaders, including George Washington, James Madison, and Benjamin Franklin. The series calls on us to reimagine history. The narrative is situated during the Revolutionary War and forces readers to rethink the history of this war, most often taught in schools and portrayed in films like The Patriot. In the afterword to the second book, Ashes, Anderson reports that by the beginning of the American Revolution in 1775, there were approximately 500,000 enslaved people, a full 20% of the country's population. The protagonist is a Black slave girl who is torn from her family and forced to endure abuse, including being branded on the side of her face with an eye for her insolence to her master. Even though slavery is most often associated with the South, Isabel lives in New York as a slave, a reminder that slavery is part of all Americans' history. She, along with a young Black boy named Curzon, steal messages for the revolutionary forces from their loyalist masters, knowing that death awaits them if they are caught. By the end of the first novel, they manage to escape, but this leaves them on the run and searching for Isabel's disabled younger sister, Ruth. They are motivated by their refusal to accept their current life as their enduring fate, and the clever juxtapositioning of their story with the words about freedom and the breaking of chains of taxation the British monarchy holds over the colonies functions to reinforce how freedom in America has always been limited to a select few, not in fact the many. Anderson writes that the fact that the founding fathers could devote their lives to freeing America from British rule while holding people in slavery is an appalling hypocrisy. With similar sentiments, Coates tells his young son that when white people attempt to minimize the realities of slavery, they say things like, mistakes were made, bodies were broken, people were enslaved. We meant well, we tried our best. But Coates is not having it, writing, good intention is a hall pass through history, a sleeping pill that ensures the dream. Unlike other children's books that have tended to adhere to founding myths, so called by historian Ray Raphael, such as A Birthday Cake for George Washington, the Seeds of America trilogy confronts and educates young readers about the realities of slavery and hypocrisy that shaped and to an extent defined the birth of our nation. Another book that features a child of color as an activist is Duncan Tanatihu's picture book, Separate is Never Equal, Sylvia Mendez and her family's fight for desegregation. It was published in 2014. It is the story of a family set in Orange County, California in the 1940s. This family of farm workers who were US citizens were not allowed to enroll their children in the local public school and were told, your children have to go to the Mexican school. When Mr. Mendez asks why, he is told, quote, that is how it's done. Sylvia, as the focalizing child character in the book, realizes that her lighter-skinned cousins with auburn hair are allowed to enroll in the white school. And she asks, is it because we have brown skin, thick black hair, and our last name is Mendez? To which the school secretary replies, rules are rules. And that they are, until someone takes action to resist or to change them. The Mendez family bands together and files a lawsuit to desegregate the schools in Orange County after being repeatedly ignored and rejected by school officials. During the hearing, the school officials said that Sylvia and 5,000 other children throughout the county were sent to Mexican schools to, quote, help them improve their English. To which Sylvia replies to the readers, that's a lie. They never even spoke to me. He says that they are dirty, lack personal hygiene, have lice and tuberculosis, and are inferior in scholastic ability, economic outlook, clothing, and the ability to partake in school activities. Sylvia informs the reader that what he was saying was not true and it was degrading. She admits that she was not called to the stand, but she was ready to testify if they asked her to. A 14-year-old girl named Carol Torres does testify, though, and after a year of deliberation, the judge finally rules that public education must be open to all children. Of course, the school board appealed and the case was reheard. Sylvia informs readers that she was shocked to see the NAACP, Jewish Federation, and Japanese American organizations, even indigenous people, coming forward, writing letters in support of her family's fight for equal access to quality education. Her mother proudly proclaims, "When you fight for justice, others will follow." This book teaches young readers to recognize and confront discrimination and prejudices that degrade and dehumanize people of color. The illustrations show a clear division between the white kids and the Mexican or Hispanic kids who are brown, when on their first day, a voice tells Sylvia, "Go back to the Mexican school where you belong." By the end of the book, Sylvia plays happily on a swing with a white girl and makes many friends. This supports the education specialist who testifies when he says, in order for people of the US to understand one another, it is necessary for them to live together. Intergroup contact is a strategy towards peaceful coexistence. Though this case is often overshadowed by the Brown versus Board of Education decision, Sylvia Mendez and her family secured integration in California in 1947, 7 years prior to the Brown versus Board of Education case. The case set a precedent for integration in other parts of America and supports Ortiz's call for us to reconsider the intersectional histories of collective struggles for liberation for all people of color in the US. Two other books feature child focalizing characters and protagonists. One is Child of the Civil Rights Movement, published in 2009, and the other is The Youngest Marcher, my apologies, by Cynthia Levinson. Child of the Civil Rights Movement is an autobiographical account of the author's childhood when Jim Crow laws were in full effect. After seeing the Freedom Riders, which were groups of white and Black students who started riding buses together to protest segregation following Rosa Parks' refusal to move and the Montgomery bus boycotts of 55 and 56, Shelton's parents decide to pack up their family and move back to Georgia to join the cause for equality. When they are refused entry into a restaurant for whites only, Paula begins to cry, and her parents sat her right down in front of the door and let her cry. She writes, "I screamed at the top of my lungs, my very first protest, my very own sit-in, but they still wouldn't let us in." She, like Audrey Faye Hendricks in The Youngest Marcher, recounts hanging out with Uncle Martin, with whom her family was close. And because we all struggled together, we were brought together for a common goal, for a common good. We were one family, the family of the Civil Rights Movement. The story ends with a depiction of the August 6, 1965 presidential signing of the Voting Rights Act. And upon reflection, Shelton writes that it, quote, "made me glow with pride to know that I had played one small part." The Youngest Marcher, the story of Audrey Faye Hendricks, was published in 2017. It accounts how a family friend visits Uncle Martin, sits at the table with her family, and when they're discussing segregation, Audrey tells him, "I want to eat my ice cream inside Newberry's. I want to sit downstairs at the Alabama. I don't want hand-me-down school books." Her mama tells her to hush, saying that 9-year-old children should not speak in front of company. But Audrey doesn't want to keep quiet. She knows all about segregation because it informs every aspect of her life. She hears testimonies at church of Black people not being hired, being chased by the KKK, and being targeted by police. One day, after hearing a sermon from Martin Luther King Jr., telling Black people to fill the jails if that's what it takes, the adults refuse, mostly because they're scared that they may lose their jobs, their homes, and their lives. Another leading figure named Jim announces, "Well, if adults won't do it, fill the jails with children." Then Audrey leaped to her feet. Though she was nervous, her parents and grandmother were proud of her, and she knew it. She became the youngest marcher at 9 years old in what became known as the Children's Crusade. As explained by the National Museum of African American History and Culture, on May 2nd, 1963, more than 1,000 students skipped classes and gathered in Birmingham, Alabama, As they approached police lines, hundreds were arrested and carried off to jail. When hundreds more young people gathered the following day for another march, the white commissioner directed local police and fire departments to use force to halt their demonstrations. Images of children being blasted by high-pressure hoses, being clubbed by police officers, and being attacked by police dogs appeared on television and in newspapers and triggered outrage throughout the world. Despite the violence, children continued to march and protest. Rather than waking up at the end of the march in the safety of her grandparents' home like Shelton did, Audrey spent 7 days in juvenile hall, during which time she was questioned by 4 white men who glared at her and asked her what they talk about in their meetings. She replies, "Our freedom." When asked why she marched, she said, "To go places and do things like anybody else." Readers are positioned to see nothing is wrong with wanting to be treated equally. She admits that jail was harder than she thought, and she wasn't fine. She slept on a cold, hard mattress, was given only greasy grits to eat, but 2 months later, the city of Birmingham wiped segregation clean off the books, and JFK publicly supported civil rights legislation, which was a contributing factor to his assassination in Dallas in November of the same year. The following year, on July 2nd, 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into federal law, banning segregation in public spheres. Like the previous book, the last 2-page spread shows Audrey eating at the same ice cream counter with white children, and the last page reads, "Black and white together, just like we belong." Sit In, How 4 Friends Stood Up by Sitting Down was a book published in 2010. It's set in my home state of North Carolina and depicts the event where on February 1st, 1960, 4 young Black college students went into Woolworth's lunch counter, sat down and ordered a coffee and a donut each. Because there was a whites only policy, they were not served, but they refused to move. And their refusal sparked a movement of peaceful protest in the form of sit-ins, inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King's call to, quote, "meet violence with love." This sentiment is echoed in the book. The author, Andrea Pinky, states that the story of these 4 students reminds young people that no matter how old you are, you can make a change in the world. Sadly, though expected, children's books published each year mostly feature white protagonists. And I have some statistics here that I can go into about that. But I want to get to the part where I talk about, the idea of Walter Dean Myers, a prolific African-American author, saying that he doesn't want to become a Black representative or some shining example of diversity. What he really wanted was to be an integral part and valued part of a mosaic that he saw around him growing up as a Black teenager in Harlem and trying to become a writer. While books are important, these books are important. They point to larger issues that when children of color are portrayed in children's books, the story is often one of struggle and overcoming. Even in the baby board book, Woke Baby by Mahogany Old Brown, published in 2018, a cute, chubby Black baby stretches his fist, fingers curled into a panther's paw, point up, 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 reaching for justice, and uses their voice, loud and wailing, like a good revolutionary. A student of color in my children's lit class last year pointed out that this book made her sad because it reflects the reality that children of color in the US continue to have to learn that their lives will be full of struggle and that they must be vigilant in the fight for social justice. There have been few books that feature Black kids with just mundane, normal lives, though they do exist. Myers confesses that he was deeply affected upon reading James Baldwin's Sunny Blues because it was a story concerned with Black people like those he knew. He wrote, "By humanizing the people who were like me, Baldwin's story humanized me." While the number of children's books featuring children of color as protagonists continues to increase yearly, there remains problematic issues. Most of these books, for instance, still privilege the role of the adults as the agentic force of social transformation. These books still tend to ignore rather than highlight intersectional histories of activism and resistance, such as those Ortiz begs us to reimagine and better understand. The ending pages feature just Blacks and whites together, or Sylvia making friends with a white girl at her school, which glosses over the ongoing struggle for liberty and equality that so many children of color in the US face today. There are books that have tried to overcome some of these issues that could be paired with stories of activism and encourage today's children of all races to be engaged citizens in the fight for equality and social justice. These include those that you see here.